This PowerPoint will prepare you for the test that's over chapters 1 through 5. It will be held in MyLab online and has about 17 questions. Some of those questions are multiple choice to test over concepts. Some are problems, and the others are about Caesar's Palace. You'll need to be able to prepare a cost of goods sold statement. More than just memorizing this, I want you to understand and just be able to think it through. In order to figure out how many goods are gone, that's our cost of goods sold, we start with how many goods we had at the beginning. So our beginning inventory is what we had on hand. We add to that everything that we've purchased. That gives us all of the goods we have available for sale. So from that number, someone goes out and does an inventory count to determine how much is left. What we had available to sell minus what is left tells us the goods that are gone, called cost of goods sold. If you want to give it a try, developing a cost of goods sold statement, just pause here and the answers will be on the next screen. It shouldn't have been too hard. You did have to ignore some of the expenses that really aren't part of inventory. The one you may have missed is freight in and import duties. All of this becomes part of the actual cost of our inventory. So we have an ending inventory or ending cost of goods sold. That's all of our goods that are gone of $417,000. So you'll see here that that line item, cost of goods sold, shows up on the income statement. This isn't an income statement based on this cost of goods sold, as you can see. The amounts are different. But I wanted to include this here because you will need to be able to build a simple income statement like this one from Sleek and Shiny. In class, we looked up and talked about these different kinds of companies. Some are manufacturing companies, some are service companies, but they all use either process or job costing to determine their costs of goods. In the test, you will need to be able to identify the proper costing system for different companies. They won't be listed by name like it is here, but you will need to know, like for number one, what would a janitorial company probably use, process or job costing, and so on. The answers are on the next page. Click pause to review the answers. You'll remember that the three elements that go into calculating the cost of a job is the direct labor, the direct materials, and the portion of manufacturing overhead that's allocated to the job. One way that we often use this information is to calculate the price that we're going to charge to customers. In some industries, we take this job cost and we apply a markup to it, and that is the price. Be sure that you know, understand, and can use both of these equations related to manufacturing overhead. A good example of a problem where we are needing to identify the cost of a job and the allocated manufacturing overhead is E3-19A, which is Playtime Industries. We worked through this in class. If we add together the direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturer's overhead, we'll get a total cost of $24,680. If we mark that up 28%, we'll get the price of $31,590. If you want to try this in MyLab, you can look up E3-19A. This graphic kind of reminds us of those two different methods in calculating costing: job costing, which we use for individual unique items, and process costing. So remember that in job costing, we practiced three different ways. One was plant-wide costing. That allocated manufacturer's overhead based on a plant-wide rate. We also looked at departmental costing, which allocated jobs and manufacturers' overhead based on departments. And then finally, we did activity-based costing, which looks at the activities and allocates the costs of direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturers' overhead based on the activities that happen in the manufacturing environment. We did learn that these are listed in the order of accuracy. In most cases, the plant-wide costing is the least accurate. Departmental costing gets us a better allocation of costing, but the best allocation of costing comes with activity-based costing. When we're calculating things that can just be continued over and over again, like picante sauce and jelly beans, we can do process costing. In its most simple format, to determine the cost per unit, we just take the total cost divided by the number of units that we're making. It's not always that simple, but that is the theory. Here's an example that we had for our company that was making ellipticals and treadmills. So when we use just the plant-wide overhead rate, we showed that both the elliptical and the treadmill were costed out exactly the same, which makes sense because we just looked at the total costs and divided them by the total units. When we looked at departmental overhead rates, the costs got more specific and closer to actual, but it wasn't until we did activity-based costing that we had the most accurate costing. That was because we looked at how much time each unit, either the elliptical or the treadmill, how much time it spent in different activities based on how much those activities were costing the company. This slide helps us understand the steps that are involved in calculating the overhead rates for departments. I want you to be able to understand these more than memorize them. Let's go ahead and look at them. Step 1, you need to estimate the total manufacturing overhead costs incurred in each department in the upcoming year. Remember that each of our estimates help us to set up the allocation that we're going to use. So we base our allocation on estimates, starting with our total estimate for manufacturer's overhead for the entire year. Step 2 is to select an allocation base. We've also called that a cost driver. So we want to determine what is the best cost driver. We often just use direct labor, but we determined, especially with Caesar's Palace, that direct labor isn't necessarily a good cost driver for every department. Step 3 is to calculate the departmental overhead rates. So we do that, here's an important equation, by taking the total estimated department overhead cost pool. It's a lot of words to describe all of the overhead that is related to that department. And we divide it by the total estimated amount of the department allocation base. That is our cost driver. So our total departmental overhead divided by our cost driver. Step 4 is to allocate some of the manufacturing overhead from each department to the individual jobs that use those departments. So we're going to use that overhead rate that we calculated in step 3, and we're going to multiply it times the actual amount. So everything up to this point has been based on estimates. Now we're taking a hard look at what those estimates would generate applied to our actual job. Here are the steps to activity-based costing. We first need to identify the activities. So what activities are involved in our manufacturing process? The next is to estimate the total manufacturing overhead for each one of these activities. Then we need to select an allocation base for each activity, a cost driver. After that, we need to estimate the activity cost allocation rate. That's similar to what we talked about in the previous slide. And finally, we want to calculate our direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturer's overhead for each activity. Now let's take a look at how process costing works. The 5 steps involved here are, first, we need to summarize the flow of physical units. So remember that we need to identify how many physical units we're tracking. That would be the physical units that we started with in inventory, and any physical units that began the process, subtracting all of the physical units that were completed and put into finished goods. So we need to be able to track all of our physical units. Step 2, we need to compute our output in terms of the equivalent units. So not all of our physical units should be counted as one physical unit. We need to determine equivalent units based on how complete they are in the work in process. Step 3 is to summarize the total cost to account for. Now, we've been working with units up till this point. Now, beginning in step 3, we're looking at the total cost. So we're going to look at the dollars spent. Step 4 is to compute the cost per equivalent unit. So we take our cost divided by equivalent unit to come up with a per equivalent unit cost. And finally, step 5, we're going to assign total cost to the units completed and to the units in ending work in process inventory. Well, you can see I don't have any answers here, but all of you took with you your handout for S5-9. You will want to be able to work through this problem, and I'll show you the second page of it as well. Here's the second part to S5-9. You need to be able to assign cost to all of the materials or the inventory that has been transferred out, as well as assigning cost to those inventory items that are still in work in process. In addition to all of this that we've talked about, you'll also want to be able to complete problems such as S4-2 and S4-6. You can find those in the study plan of my lab. Also, you will want to have Caesar's Palace chapters 2 through 5 close and handy. That information you will be able to use on the test.